I'll probably just give a little bit of background, I suppose, as to why I'm so involved with drug policy and kind of community response to drug policy. So I'm from Kilnarden, which is just across the road. I've grown up there my entire life. And I suppose I would have been a drug user at points in time in my life, and a lot of my friends were then ended up on the likes of heroin and in and out of treatment and in and out of services. So my childhood was very much dominated by drug use, and I suppose I wouldn't have had an understanding now. Look, like at the time, it was just that's just how it was. It just was that, and I suppose over the years, through working in the addiction sector for 20 odd years, in this community as well. So I ran drug services in Kilnarden. I also ran them in Bluebell and down at St. Dominic's. Everything from programs for young heroin users who are like 12, 13, 14 from my own community, to developing drug services in Bluebell and then within the homeless sector as well. So after spending years working in addiction and kind of really beginning to, I suppose, mature myself and being able to actually engage on why are things the way they are, I suppose I started to kind of look more into policy and how policy is structured. And for me, when I left the addiction sector to go to college in and around the years of austerity, because I started to really realise then the interaction between state policies and decisions and what we could and couldn't continue to do at a community level once we became a target, I suppose, in terms of austerity measures. So I started to really feel that, I suppose, I realised the lack of control I had to be able to continue to do important work, important initiatives, that it could be literally just taken away at any time by people that don't understand the actual impacts, I suppose, of our services and the services that we provide on people who have experienced addiction. So I ran everything from like women's groups to like family kind of support, one-to-one counselling groups for young men, and they were just getting eroded away. And I left the addiction sector to kind of go to college to try and start to really maybe develop what I knew on a gut instinctual level about drugs, and I wanted to try and create the framework around it then so that I could, I suppose, speak about it in a way that I could articulate, I suppose, what I already knew. And that's why I went to college. I went to Trinity and I studied politics, economics, sociology and philosophy. And I continued to work in the homeless sector at the time. I also done a bit of outreach in Crumlin and Drimnagh in the evenings as well. So while I was in college, I was still kind of connected in to community initiatives. I think I'd say I was about 4 years in Trinity then when I started to really, I suppose, become more and more aware of the Drugs Act. And as a drugs worker, you're working on the ground, right? So you're doing the firefighting stuff, you're trying to support people, you're trying to do the interventions. And you don't always get to then have the luxury to engage in the talk to go with that. So when I was in college, I was able to step away a little bit and I was able to start actually thinking about the bigger picture, because I wasn't obviously working 40 hours a week in it. So I was able to think a little bit better about it. So I started to kind of really study the Drugs Acts and where drug policies come from, and I became, I suppose, acutely aware then that our drug policies were classist, complete classist. And the fact that legislation exists, but it's unequally distributed then, because, you know, in Trinity, I suppose I have friends who would be smoking weed or would be taking E, and the likelihood of them ever encountering a guard and a random stop and search was almost nil. But then I come back into my own community and I watch my friends be stopped and searched for no apparent reasons, guards, constant presence of over-policing in communities. But yet it's still the same. Like, so you're from one community, you're not policed, you have, you know, 50 euros worth of weed in your pocket, you're from a different community, you're doing the exact same thing, but you're never going to probably end up in prison for it in the way that you are in many working class communities or minority groups or marginalised groups. So I suppose, when I got elected, it was my goal to kind of really try and just kind of pull the curtain back on that a little bit and actually start getting people to think about how classist drug policy is in Ireland. And so in 2017, I drafted a legislation that I tabled called I changed it to, I think, drug rehabilitative, I can't remember the name of the old bill now, but I kind of didn't call it decriminalisation because there's so much people, I think they purposely, sometimes politicians confuse legalisation and decriminalisation so that people kind of get a little bit scared, we're going to legalise, and I'll break down the differences, I suppose, for anyone that doesn't know in terms of decriminalisation and legalisation. But my bill decriminalised possession. So for me, it was about the decriminalisation of marginalisation, and that's what I kept trying to tell them. It's about the person, the individual, not the substance. But I suppose conservative policymakers keep pulling it back and going, but what about heroin? Or what about heroin? Or what about crack? And you're like, no, it's not about the substance. It's not about the substance. And I suppose that's what I've been trying to do all this time, is to not move into a space where we're creating a hierarchy of substances, right? Because it's not about that, it's about environment, it's about people, how they live, it's about how they cope, it's about how they survive. And if we keep focusing in on the specific drug, well then we're still failing, because that's not what it is. It's not a war on drugs, it's actually about people and what they use and why they use. And thousands of people in Ireland use drugs without ever needing intervention or any sort of support or any sort of help, right? It's like, in England and Wales, I think the statistics are 1 in every 3 people use drugs, and addiction is rare, right? But addiction manifests itself in a very obvious way in communities that are very marginalised or have experienced a lot of trauma. So for me, creating community initiatives or creating drug policy, it needs to be person-centred and not focus on a type of substance. And I think that's what I have a little bit of fear in Ireland at the minute, because everyone is jumping on the, cannabis, and I'm like, well, no, don't do that, please, because it's like that's just another now classist legislation you're asking for if you're only asking for one type of drug, and that's used across postcodes, right? And you don't, because then you're still actually failing people who have ended up in addiction. If you legalise or decriminalise only cannabis, you're still actually just criminalising the poor or criminalising people who have serious addiction issues. So just decriminalising cannabis was absolutely not for any of those groups that I suppose been advocating for and working with for 25 years. So I suppose the bill at the time, they asked me not to push it to a vote because they said we'll set up a public consultation. And so I agreed, and I said I won't push it to a vote. They set up the public consultation, and the health department had its highest ever submission rate to a consultation ever in the state. It was like 22,000 submissions on drug decriminalisation. They haven't released what came back, but we have seen snippets over time where a high percentage of people were saying you shouldn't end up in a court because of drug possession. So the public was obviously way ahead again of policymakers, saying it doesn't make sense that somebody that has drugs in their pocket for possession for their own use should end up in the justice system at all. So then they set up a working group that was led by Garrett Sheehan, who actively campaigned, I suppose, in a sense, against the evidence. So you had a chair that then came out and said really there should be harsher penalties, and completely ignored all the evidence. So they came up with this version, which they're going to pilot, which is they're trying to call it a diversion, but it's not, because it's a health. They're saying it like it dealt with in a health way the first time you're caught with drugs in your pocket, but after that it goes back into being a justice issue. So that doesn't make any sense, because again, the only person most likely to only ever get caught once with drugs are people who are from maybe a better off background, that are not struggling with addiction and are not going to encounter guards in a consistent way on an ongoing basis. So again, it's a law or a suggestion of a law or a policy that literally still only protects people from more privileged backgrounds, and it still marginalises against anybody else who has any sort of kind of daily drug use or dependency. So from there then, what we have now, I hope, is a Citizens' Assembly on the way. I think the Citizens' Assembly will be announced for this year. And so what's important for that from a community perspective is for the likes of these communities and stuff to really actually be able to participate and understand, I suppose, the issues in its broadest sense and how that voice can be heard. It's about ensuring that the question asked at that citizens' assembly is not narrow. But for me, I suppose, going into a citizens' assembly is, and for anybody that's campaigning actively in the area of drug use, is you have to be able to look at environments and the equality of people's conditions. And I think people get so focused on the type of drug being the harmful thing, or heroin is the harmful thing, or crack is the harmful thing, when in a sense that was the response to the harmful thing, you know, and that's what we need to focus on. So we need to be able to focus on people's communities, their living conditions, their opportunities, the safety of people's lives, the education system. And the more we allow the narrative and dialogue to be pushed towards the substance, we actually allow them off, like, because they want to blame drugs. So like in communities like this, sometimes I think they blame drugs for the conditions instead of the other way around, when it's actually the conditions is what led to the kind of, you know, manifestation of so much drug use, you know. And, you know, I don't know whether it's philosophical, right, but I started to think about this around how addiction actually probably saved many lives in communities like this, which feels a little bit like, you know, does that really make sense? But I suppose what I'm getting at is, if you experience so much death or abuse or violence, well, it's very hard to experience a lot of hard stuff on a daily, consistent basis and to be able to process that. So nobody can really process the amount of harm that sometimes happens to people in communities that are poorly resourced. And addiction is like a space that's created that creates a safety of having to try and process all the stuff that you've experienced. And then it also kind of sometimes is like, so the more neoliberal that society gets as well, and the kind of resistance towards like a neoliberal capitalistic style state, addiction is a space in which to exist in, you know, and it's a space in which, where it's because of self-medication, whether it's because of pain, whether it's because of trauma, or whether it's just to be able to actually survive in your day and not want to actually just check out. So like addiction sometimes actually prolongs people's day because they're trying to numb stuff. And it's that numbing of stuff that probably stops them, you know, doing a lot worse to themselves, like, and it allows them to exist in a point in time. So if people are responding to situations, if addiction is a response, well then we need to look at what it's responding to. And that's what drugs policy, citizens' assemblies, youth movements, community groups, we need to constantly keep coming back to what are we responding to, what is addiction responding to. And that's where we need to, I suppose, put our efforts and our supports, because chasing the drug and the type of the drug, and this drug is harmful and that drug is harmful, it's actually just a red herring to distract you from all the reasons why people are using drugs in the first place, you know. So I suppose I'm hoping that the Citizens Assembly does that. And I think sometimes as well, like drugs projects, because they're firefighting in the way that they are, sometimes they also internalise. So a lot of services and people themselves who are in and out of services have sometimes internalised the narrative that's been told about them for years as well. Like, you know, in terms of, you know, it's a choice, you chose to do this, or it's, you know, or we should, like, there's drug users that don't think drugs should be decriminalised. So when you ask that, I always find that you think like that's a bit mad, that they're promoting for themselves to be in prison, like. But when you actually try and unpack it with people, then they don't actually think that. But it's like it's so ingrained. The oppression is so ingrained in us. We're going, oh yeah, lock us up. that's what should happen. So it doesn't make sense. Like, but when you reframe the questions back and you ask them, well, do you think you're a criminal for using drugs? And they usually say no, which is the complete opposite of saying it shouldn't be decriminalised. So sometimes it's just about how we talk and how we ask questions and how we tease the issues out, so that we're not actually reinforcing the oppression that we actually feel. And I think sometimes we actually reinforce our own oppression just because of years of thinking that we deserve, you know. I do run philosophy groups in different communities, and some of the stuff we unpack are these phrases that we use, like, you know, you get what you deserve. you know, the way like people say, oh yeah, you definitely deserve that, or she got what she deserves. Well, what does that really mean? What are we saying about ourselves as people if we're saying that we deserve all these shitty things that are happening to us? So it's a real like being able to try and find spaces in communities that actually have some of those dialogues, which is why I set up the philosophy groups. Because if I keep only focusing on trying to get people out of addiction or into a safer place with addiction, and then we never really get to have the dialogue, because you're again just dealing with the kind of immediate of the drug use. But to create the philosophy groups in the community, we run one in Dolphin House, we run one with a drug-free social kind of group that are in different various stages of recovery, and we're in the process of setting one up with some Traveller men at the Travellers CDP, and they're all about trying to create spaces in communities where you talk about the bigger issues instead of what we think our failings are. It's like when we put a load of people in a room that experience poverty and ask them to solve the problem of poverty, right? When they didn't create it, they don't have the capital to change that situation, but yet we keep going into the hearts of communities like this and going, you know, well, what can we do to like sort out this drug crisis, or what do we do to sort out the low employment rate? And it's like, well, you actually can't do anything about that. So it's like, how do we get people into rooms to have those big discussions, but then actually focus it back on how do we get privileged people to sit in a room and address their own privilege instead of asking us to address their own poverty, because they have the capital, the means, the know-how, the decision-making to be able to actually change their situation. We don't have that. But the more they keep putting it on us, we somehow think that we're responsible to be able to fix everything that's around us. Do you know what I mean? And that's just an impossible task, really, when we don't have the means to actually do that. What we do have, obviously, is each other and solidarity, and we look out for each other, and we're loyal to each other, and we mind each other, and we have all of that. But it's about trying to find spaces then for people to be able to tease out them big questions so they're not feeling so trapped in their own lives or their own ideas that they have about themselves. Does anyone have any questions around, or anything in particular they'd like me to speak further on?
Yeah, I have one question.
Yeah.
You mentioned solidarity in the community. What is solidarity in the community in relation to drug abuse, rather?
So it's I suppose we accept each other in a sense. So it's not necessarily solidarity in the political sense or the push sense or the big, you know, the outward sense, but we don't judge each other. And the judgment comes from outside. Now we'll give out to each other every now and again or whatever, but actually, you know, do you ever say, like, you know, when people are talking about like setting up, like people are going, we've no community, we've to get community back and stuff. I always think that's a funny thing to say, because I actually think there are people that don't understand community, and that it actually does still exist and it's there. And I know I'm certainly in a community that I've never moved out of. And we still look after each other, and we still step in for each other, and we still mind each other when we're needed, and we still look out for each other. Even sometimes when we're harming each other, we still come back to minding each other again, you know? And that support network that we have to each other, that's the solidarity, I think. Do you know what I mean? And I think sometimes we probably see solidarity too much as like a movement or something tangible to point at, like a, you know, like I suppose years ago in the mid-90s in Tallaght, people thought the vigilantism was sort of community solidarity, and you know, my memories of that time is very different to somehow when you turn on the telly and they're talking about the good old days when the community took its power back, and it's like, well, that's not actually what happened at all. Actually, you had huge numbers of people marching on people's houses for very low level drug use, for robbing cars. Again, it was, we just need to remove this family and everything will be grand. And it's like, well, that's not true, because that's again not focusing on the conditions and the fact that all those families needed actually support, and they needed they needed us more to kind of intervene and ask, you know, is there anything we can do for you? But instead what they got was hundreds of people marching on their house, which was always a mad experience for me as a child growing up to watch to watch that play out, and a lot of people that actually weren't from our community anyway, you know, and really infiltrating that space, and kind of parents were in so much fear, and they were like, you know, we need to get heroin off our streets, so this is what we need to do. So a lot of parents that cared were really duped into that space in the beginning, but then they literally erected huts on our fields where we lived. Do you know what I mean? Green huts that they sat in all night looking out of. And you think back, it's like, how mad is that? Like, you're already being policed, and then you've this group of concerned parents also policing you, and actually creating the unsafety in the community. Because I'm telling you, I felt safe before that was there, and then that was there and I felt unsafe. But my first introduction to violence was the guards, and it was the vigilantism. So actually they taught me violence. You know, it wasn't part of my life before I witnessed really brutal violence on the behalf of those two groupings. Do you know what I mean? So it's hard, I think, to see things like that as community solidarity. But a lot of people probably felt that it was at the time. I definitely didn't. But I suppose, like, you had the report launched very recently in terms of the crack issue, which has been here a long time. It's not new. People are just talking about it now. But I was, giving out crack pipes, God, 2008. Do you know what I mean? And trying to teach people at the time that you can still catch bloodborne viruses and stuff through the sharing of crack pipes. Because at that time, people only really had the knowledge on needle use, and they hadn't really kind of pieced together that it was still good to have your own paraphernalia with crack use. So crack use has been here a long, long time, but it's becoming more and more and more entrenched. But I think what's happening at the minute in Tallaght is, in terms of us standing up and saying, "No, you need to fund our services here," is that finally the services are speaking up. Because for years now, since austerity, they pitted us all against each other for saying little buckets of funding. So then the solidarity we had as services evaporated, and it felt orchestrated, because we were all then vying for the same funding to hold on to this initiative for Jobstown, or I need this for Killinarden, or I need this for Fettercairn. So what was a kind of grouping of solidarity across the group's task forces was really, really kind of interrupted in a sense. But I think what happened then as well is services stopped advocating for the people that they're supposed to work for. They stopped, and they still are not advocating for the people that they work for in a general sense right across Dublin. Obviously, I'm most familiar with Dublin, so it's easier for me to reference Dublin than any services outside. But the funding opportunities or funders I suppose have used the fact that we rely on their funding for us to actually stop speaking and stop highlighting issues, because you do get reprimanded by the state for actually advocating for the people the service is set up for. And it's like, you brought a load of media attention on this, so that's really bad, and it's really disrespectful to us, the state. And it's like, wait, what? Do you know what I mean? Like, you're just gonna go home. Like, what do you mean you're disrespected because we stood up for a community of people that needed services? Do you know what I mean? So it's this real transactional thing that's happening now between services and between the state, where people are being failed in the middle because people are afraid to lose the funding, which means we're doing a disservice to everyone, Yeah,
one question I would have as well on that is, you talked about drug abuse being a response to the problems within the community, and then of course, over-policing and various other things being a response to the drug abuse. Can you talk a bit about the problems that have been caused by those responses, by government responses in some ways?
Yeah, well, I suppose one of them is the advocacy issue, but then, there's also has been an over-professionalisation in communities. So you have communities that were set up and community groups and responses set up by locals, and set up by, the women in many cases. And then, as time moved on, I suppose outside of those communities, you have people that now see them services as a career. It wasn't a career for us, it was a response and it was a need. And now we are someone else's career that are not from these communities or have not experienced what we experience. And they come in with good intentions, but actually they don't really understand. So what happens is then you have all these people that were embedded in the community, had the local knowledge and the local respect, were pushed out by people then with like, you needed a degree, now you need a master's, and it's like that's not community development. So if you're like, say, from a really traditional background, and this is not in any way a slight on people, like, cause people can be from anywhere and still be good at their job, so it's not that, but it's like, we pride ourselves, I suppose, on the principles of community development. So if you're working in an organisation that promotes community development, but you're the CEO of that organisation, and you came in there as a career choice, that's not community development. Because if we were doing community development, then the woman from Cushlawn who set up the youth centre, she'd be the CEO, or you know what I mean, like you'd be, that's where you'd be moving towards. But you've an over professionalisation, do you know what I mean? So people came in and then it was like, no, you need this expertise and you need that expertise. So now you just have service provision in communities that doesn't have enough local people actually in them. So I think that, and you have the state pulling back the decision making closer and closer centrally, away from actual communities being able to make decisions on how they're funded themselves. There was a point in time where the likes of community development projects had kind of local decision making on what they were doing, but then everything became like an algorithm and everything became like an economic output, and people's lives can't be measured in the same way that a financial institution can measure what it's doing. But yet the state has imposed reporting mechanisms on lives that you can't, like, just so much of the work in these communities is invisible. You can't name it. Like, it's not something that you can go, we've had 16 people, you know, are now whatever. It's not like, we're not economic units. So I think what happened, one of the policies that I think the state has got wrong is over professionalising the sector to a point where it pushed out all the people that actually understood it in a way that you don't get by getting a degree, you know. So that's one policy. The other one then is spent convictions policy as well. Like in Ireland, you can only have one conviction spent on your record. If you get more than one conviction, you get none of them can be spent. They'll be staying there forever. Now, like, you could get 9 convictions from one event. Do you know what I mean? Like, you could get loads of convictions in one instance. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, so there are other policies as well that I feel also force people out of the jobs that should be like social work. Like, imagine having so much more social workers that understood the communities in which they were going into and trying to support families or working with families and understanding those families. But if you have a conviction, you're never going into that, you know. Or you know, you're Garda vet to be a youth worker, you're Garda vet to be a drugs worker, you're Garda vet to be an addiction counsellor. So you have lots of people that went and upskilled. I have friends that are in recovery that have PhDs. Like, I always remember one friend saying to me, he's like, I actually wish I never got the PhD. I wish I'd never done this. He's like, because now I'm like super conscious and aware of everything. I still can't get a job, and I'm more depressed now than I ever was, you know. And it's like, we keep pushing people to get, if you just get an education, but then when you get the education, you're still excluded because of where you're from or what you sound like, or the fact that you might have a conviction from the past that's nothing got to do with the job that you're going for, like nothing. So I think that it's a consciousness thing that needs to happen first with communities is going, because when I realised that my experience wasn't replicated across the whole of Dublin, that was an awakening for me. You know, I was like, wait, what? Like, I thought, I didn't know there was a different Dublin, you know, until I was a certain age. And I think we often spend so much time in our community, we don't go anywhere for anything else. Like, Tallagh's a big place as well. If you look at Tallaght, like, I mean, you don't need to go anywhere else if you live in Tallaght. Like, you know, you can shop in Tallaght, you can go to your schools in Tallaght, you can go to your nightlife in Tallaght, you can go to the, you know, so everything exists in that space. Do you know? So sometimes we, like, there's this level of acceptance that this is just the way it is. And I think if we can support people to push past that this is just the way it is, to push past that acceptance and to know that they're worth more and valued more and deserve more, I think that's what we need to get to, instead of focusing on the particular problems, but actually empowering people's ability to be able to advocate for themselves, to be able to exercise their own rights, to be able to even recognise their own rights, and to be able to recognise that their own rights are being are not being met. Because sometimes we don't, because again we're stuck in it. This is just how it is. We have no power. We can't do anything about this. And I think that that's what needs to happen. People need to know that it shouldn't be like this, and it's not their fault that it is.
One final question I have as well is, you talk about people wanting to know their rights and learn more about the situation. Are there any particular projects that you can think of happening in Tallaght at the moment that you can recommend people get involved with? You mentioned a philosophy group there as well. Is there anything along those lines that you can recommend?
Well, I think setting up those dialogue spaces is important, and finding ways to bring different types of people into the room, you know. And I think like the philosophy and the community piece for me is really fucking powerful, and it really gives people the space to think about things and remove them for a moment from fighting the daily struggles to actually begin to think. And I've watched people at the start of those philosophy classes have so sometimes we might pick a sentence and say, do you agree with this or do you not agree with this? And it kind of splits the room in whatever way, like, you know, and then they debate back and forth on why they do agree and why they don't agree. And then Robert Grant is a philosophy lecturer from Trinity, so he facilitates the sessions and stuff as well. So he'll then bring in some of the philosophical kind of theories that they didn't realise that they were engaging in every day. Like, what is freedom? What is liberty? What is it to make decisions? What is it to, so people engage in philosophy all day long, but they think it's some other academic thing that's beyond them, when actually they're philosophical. Like, you know, a person who's trying to figure out how to feed their drug habit for the day is engaged in critical thought, reasoning, logic, everything, problem solving. Like, it's like the most resourceful mindset. Like, if you have to guess something, how are you going to get it? And you break that down in your head of how you're going to get it. So it's like, well, how do you take them our everyday lived realities and show how these are the big philosophical topics? And I think setting up more of those types of groups in communities where people can think, and I've watched people change their opinion, you know, throughout the course of a conversation, because it's also about the active listening piece. So we try and encourage people to not just be waiting to get their point in, to, you know, to like, you know, to point out why the other side is wrong and what they're thinking. That actually it's not about you just waiting for them to finish so you can say something really cool you've thought of, like, you know, or really clever or whatever. But you have to actively listen to the arguments and the reasoning behind other people's decision making and views. And it actually is a really good space, because it allows us to kind of get out of our own little boxes in our heads or our own little bubbles and actually start to hear in a respectful way why people might think a certain thing.
Yeah, you say you worked in addiction centres in Crumlin and Dermot. Do you know what they were called by any chance?
So the one we did was an outreach program with it was doubled up between not ARC, so there's ARC in Crumlin, and then do you know the Sunshine Industrial Estate?
Yeah.
It's like it's on the Crumlin Road. There's a little kind of group of factories in there. I can't think of the name of the project, but it's in behind there. Works with young people specifically in terms of drug use. Yeah, and then ARC is the drugs project then in Crumlin. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, when we talk about decriminalisation on like the national level initiative, the example of Portugal always comes to mind.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how they carried it out and how that might look in Ireland?
Yeah, so the difference between Ireland and Portugal basically is that we're common law and they're civil law. So how law is administered is slightly different, because in Portugal they can do like district level sanctions, you know, or district level fines and stuff. So it's it's a little different, but it can still be done. Like, so decriminalisation can still happen. What they did in Portugal at the time was they really invested in services as well. So they knew that decriminalisation was one thing. So decriminalisation is not going to get rid of drug use, right? But it's probably going to stop it being compounded for years and years and years, because you're not going to rate your convictions and you think, oh well, I can't work anyway, or I can't travel, so I'm just fucked or whatever, you know. So decriminalisation is not about ending drug use, you know, it's actually just about ending the criminalisation of people for their drug use. So they also then invested in services so that people had an opportunity that if they wanted to engage in services that they could. And like I said, not everyone needs to engage in a service, but what happened in Portugal can happen here. The problem, as I understand it, is from that working group that set up, I think there was a lot of discussion that to decriminalise here, they think will lead to de facto legalisation, right? But what really appears to have been the conversation was, does it remove the power of guards to stop and search? So that seemed to feature a lot in the conversation. Now, I've never got full answers on like why that's an issue. First of all, why are you stopping and searching everyone if there's no reason? And secondly, like, you know, guards don't actually need a reason to stop and search. Like, I'm very aware around here, we've never been given a reason why we're being stopped and searched. It just fucking happens. Like, and the fact is, I think we can address the stop and search thing if they're concerned about it. Like, if you're being suspected of drug dealing, if it's not legalisation, right, and it's decrim, well then a guard, if he suspects that you've loads of drugs on you because you're fucking currying it or something, of course he still has reason. So it doesn't really make sense, the argument to me. But I think they're afraid it's going to affect them on that stop and search piece, which I think still needs to be teased out, because I think you could look at maybe public order policies and legislations to be able to actually try and fix that. But that's the only difference between Portugal and Ireland and being able to do it, is just that district level law.
Okay. You said when you try to argue to move it more towards a victim-focused policy instead of blaming the substance and criminalising, what response do you get from people, or why do you think they don't want to fund local services? Is it to save money, or do they think it's a simple solution of just getting rid of the bad guys I
think there's a mixture of things. I think it's probably going to be a little bit of something different for each person. So some of it's ignorance, some of it is they actually don't understand the issue, but they try and speak to it with confidence that they shouldn't. I think it's also some people sometimes they say, oh, but we can't normalise drug use, and it's like, drug use is actually probably one of the most normal things that happens in society every single day. It is normalised, so what you're trying to say, they usually don't really have a lot behind what they're saying, you know? And then they try and conflate it with drug dealing. And that's like you have to uncouple those things. Like, drug dealing is different than drug taking, but they want to constantly put them together. Because I think in some sense they want a monster to point at, so they go, the big bad drug dealer, that's him, it's his fault. When actually we created, by introducing the Drugs Act, we created the black market. So if you don't want the big bad drug dealer over there that you think is controlling all of this, well then why aren't we talking about legalisation? You know, why aren't we talking about that? Do you know what I mean? So it's like, I haven't yet kind of spoke to somebody in that decision making around drugs that's holding it back that has ever provided anything of substance in response to as why it shouldn't happen. You know, they usually just throw out the tropes, like, you know, oh, but yeah, cannabis is a gateway drug. It's like, well, that's not true either. Like, do you know what I mean? Has everyone that ended up on heroin or crack smoked cannabis? Yes, but does everyone that smokes cannabis end up on heroin or crack? No. Do you know what I mean? But they constantly go to these real Americanized, outdated assumptions on drugs. Yeah.
I'm from South Africa, and drug law in South Africa is pretty much everything is decriminalized, and you can get a lot of drugs off stores. And it just, it's always confused me since moving to Ireland why there's been such an intolerance. And I'm just wondering, why do you think there is that level of intolerance of drug users? It's not about the drugs themselves, it tends to be against the people.
So in Ireland, we have our drugs laws came from a UN treaty called the Single Act. So if you trace it back, so the politicians now that speak on it don't know why they're intolerant, right? They've literally just picked up their phrases and ideas over years. But if you go back and read the transcripts of when this bill was being debated in the 70s, the Dáil actually set up a special committee to discuss the issue. And they all said that you shouldn't get a criminal sanction for drug use. They ignored it in the 70s, and they stood in the chamber, and I've read all the Shannon and Dahl transcripts surrounding the bill. So I wanted to know what their thinking was at the time, and what were they saying. Everyone that I read was kind of going, so, like, but we won't take a man. I think someone said we wouldn't go into a man's house and take him out for drinking whiskey. Why are we so they were even at the time going, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Most of them said there was no evidence of, like, massive drug use at the time, so there was no evidence for it. But actually it comes from America. So America was a big hitter in terms of the United Nations and trade. It didn't join the League of Nations, but it managed to actually negotiate prohibition at a UN treaty level. And the most telling thing that's said by it was the health minister was Brendan Carter at the time. So you see them going back trying to figure out why they've done this, right? They don't know. They've ignored the Dáil Special Committee on what they said. But then Brendan Carter finished off with saying, but we've now implemented our UN obligations. So that's really what it was. So it was a directive from the UN treaty on the single act, and that came from American introducing prohibition because of race, because of the jazz scene, because white men, God forbid, might have sex while stoned on marijuana with black women, and they'd have interracial relationships, and you can trace that all the way back to the conversation on race and racism. And it ends up here in our law, but it actually was intended to be a racist law from America.